Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about using effect hooks in React. So an effect hook is a way of specifying a side effect of rendering. So normally in a React application, when we have a component, that component takes in some data, some props, and then that component's job is then return the DOM that's going to be shown on the screen. So that's kind of a one-directional, it's a pure functional kind of input, right? We get inputted data, props, and then we render content on the screen. State is used to then call that function a second time, but really it's just data props in, content out. An effect hook is used when we want to have a side effect, right? We want to do something else other than show render content on the screen. Most common is going to be something that involves connecting or synchronizing with some other service or some other server. For example, fetching data is a thing that we might want to do as a side effect. Right? That's not actually like the data that's going to be sending, that's going to be putting output, like sending things, messages to other servers that isn't part of our response. Synchronizing, setting up a subscription to a service, right? Setting up listener type things to other servers or other data. That's going to be the kind of things we do inside of an effect hook. In practice, a little bit more easier way to think about this is an effect hook is basically, let's specify something we want to happen once every time when the component first renders, but not when it renders a second time. So for example, if we had our sort of, this is our Ajax demo from the previous video, if we remember that when we search for some data, that because it updates our state, that re-renders our content. An effect hook lets us be able to specify something that we want to happen only the first time the component is rendered, or only specific times the component is rendered, not every time it updates, and it updates every single time we update some state, we do some other pieces, right? Including like whenever we type in new text because we have a controlled form. Okay, so an effect hook is a hook similar to a state hook. So we import it from React as the useEffect function. So again, all hooks are generally conventionally named after use something. So this is an effect hook, so it's named useEffect. An effect hook is then a function that we call inside of our component. So generally we'll do it near the top, usually after we sort of initialize our props and our state before we sort of do any of our rendering work. We can call the useEffect function. The useEffect function takes two arguments, not one, but two arguments. The second one is technically optional, but you really always want to include it. So the first argument is going to be a function. Right, we'll fill in that function in a second. And the second argument is an array. So we have a function and we have an array. Most commonly, this function is written as an arrow function. And it takes this callback, this function gets passed in, takes no arguments. So it's really just the arrow function that we end up writing. And then, of course, we end up getting our array kind of sits there at the end as a second argument. Okay, inside this effect hook, inside this function, right, this is all the inside this callback is all the code we want to render, we want to do exactly once, only the first time a component renders. So anything we put in here, right, in my effect hook, you'll notice that it renders the content, right, and then we get inside the effect hook. And then as I search for something else, you'll notice it keeps re-rendering the content, but we never call that effect hook line of code again. Importantly, effect hooks are executed after the component renders. So you'll notice that my console log on rendering the content happens right before the return statement. So the content actually shows up on the screen before the effect hook executes, right? The component has to have been rendered, and then the effect hook kicks in order to go do its side effect, do its other kinds of work. Okay. Anything we then want to do as that side effect can go inside of this effect hook. So for example, we can take our fetching code, right? This is the code we use from this is our Ajax fetching demo code. I'm just going to unhook this. So we can define ourselves, again, our URL we want to search from. We can send that query result to that URL, call our fetch. And then, of course, once we have our data, we need to make sure that we assign that to our state. And so we can do this kind of work. We could say that when the, object, right? So that when the component first loads, it gets the effect hook, and then inside that effect hook sends the fetch request. The fetch request then gets this data, grabs it, and sets it to the state. That re-renders the component second time, but because we've re-rendered the component and because it's in the effect hook, It only ever happens once, right? We don't then download and fetch from the application again. In fact, if we tried to do this fetch outside of the effect hook, right? If we tried to just put fetch just sort of right here at the top, and we tried to just call fetch, because this thing would set the state, right? Fetch then would eventually call the state to be set. That would set state, which re-renders the app, which would call fetch, which would set the state that re-renders the app, that calls fetch, that sets the state that re-renders the app, that calls fetch, that sets the state that re-renders the app, and we get this infinite loop, this infinite rendering loop, which React would both errors out, says that you've got infinite loop, you can't do that, and GitHub would probably ban us because we're basically DDoSing their servers by sending too many requests. So that's how you can be able to do things like send requests, send fetching requests, and sort of set up subscriptions, and do other kinds of service work that are going to basically reach outside of your application or outside of your component. Note that you don't need effect hooks for everything. You really only need it for side effects, 4 times that you're talking outside of your application, right? That you're talking to some external server, that you're sending a fetch request. Those are the kinds of things that you need effect hooks for. Very rarely do you need other kind of pieces. Otherwise, you can really just manage it using state, using if statements in order to manage what you want to do. That's the basic idea of an effect hook. The one other thing that's worth noting is that sometimes if we're setting up things like a listener or a subscription, right? You're subscribing some data and you want to know anytime a website publishes some data, you want to be able to sort of update it live. You'll often want to have some way of cleaning up that work, right? So if I've set up a subscription or a listener to some website's data, when I leave that component, right? If I go to a different page, if I do something else, I might want to turn off that listener, right? I want to stop getting those updates because those updates might either be trying to set state on a component that's no longer being displayed, and that's going to cause problems, or it's just that I want to stop, downloading data from a server if I'm not using it anymore. So the way that we can set up effect hook cleaning, the way that we can sort of manage what we're doing here, is by specifying a cleanup function. So we can define that function inside of my effect hook here, right, inside of my callback. So we can define ourselves a cleanup function like this that maybe says what we want to happen when the component's being removed or when we're changing things. And then what we want to do is to make it so that our callback, right, the function that we're specifying as the callback for the use effect, that it returns that cleanup function. And then what happens is that anytime this component is unmounted, anytime it's removed, anytime we're no longer seeing that component at all, this cleanup function will get executed, which means that we can then clean up things, we can turn off listeners, we can sort of adjust things as we go. That's when we build things up. Okay, I forgot to mention talk about this array here. So what is this array doing? So this array is the second argument to use effect lists out every variable that will cause the effect hook to execute a second time. So normally, this by default, if you don't put anything there, the effect hook will actually run every time the component renders, and that's bad. You rarely want to do that because if you want it to execute every time the component renders, it shouldn't be an effect hook anyway. With an empty array, we're saying there is no other there's no other situation in which I want to rerun this effect hook. I never want this to happen again. However, we can put other variables in here. So for example, if I had some prop variable, right? So if I, for example, had maybe, I don't know, we're gonna make some stuff up, right? So let's assume that, for example, I maybe had like a current user from our props. Right. I might want to say that every time the current user changes, right, every time that value becomes different, it gains a different value from somewhere else, right? Like it literally, like the value it becomes a different thing. This says let's re-execute the effect hook whenever the current user changes. So we can put a list of every variable that would cause us to rerun our effect hook. This can be useful, for example, if I'm trying to set up like a listener, if I want to try to query something based on the current user. If the user changes, and that might happen somewhere else, if a different user logs in, I might want to say, rerun my effect hook and set up a listener to now listen for that other new user's account. While, of course, probably uninstalling or unconnecting from the old user's account. So this is how we can be able to structure things that we want to rerun this. In general, this list should probably be empty. In most of the times when you're running effect hooks, you don't want to rerun it. And then if you find there's a situation where like, oh yes, when this variable changes, I actually do want to rerun the effect hook, and you explicitly think, yes, I want to rerun this, then you can add another variable into there. if React or your IDE or some other thing tries to say like, oh, it looks like you're trying to reference a variable that from outside that you want to, that you want to be able to put in here, really think about whether you want to follow that suggestion or not. Most likely, if you're trying to reference some variable, so for example, if I had the URL to find out here, right, it would probably tell me you need to go include, because you're trying to reference URL outside the effect hook, you need, and it might change, you need to put URL inside of here. The answer is probably don't put stuff outside that effect hook, put it in the effect hook. Anything that's being used in that like function should exist inside that function, keep it self-contained. And that'll tend to make your application sort of work the best. Right, see, this is where it says it can't, your promise. Oh, oops, sorry, I just had the order. That's just the order right there. Actually, here, let me just see real fast if I can't get to do its thing. Nah, never mind, it won't do it. Okay, great. So again, generally make this an empty array. If you ever get told that it should not be an empty array, think carefully about that. But again, we can put in other functions to say when, if this variable, if this prop, if this other thing changes, redo my effect hook, hook up a different listener, do some other kind of work. Okay. React applications can have multiple effect hooks in each component. So for example, I could have a second effect hook here. It's fine. That does something else. This is some other effect hook. You can include multiples of these. That's not a problem. It's also okay to just have a single one. Generally, you would distinguish between them about when they get executed, right? What their dependencies are. I often think about using different effect hooks for different things, right? If I have one effect hook that's managing my fetching and another effect hook that's managing some other subscription, I'll put those in two different effect hooks just to keep them organized. That way I can like manipulate one without mess up the other. Cool. All right. That's the basic idea, again, of how an effect hook works. You are going to make sure you import useEffect from React. You call the useEffect function. You pass in a callback on what you want to do the first time that component loads, and then make sure you remember your array, your empty array of dependencies as the second argument, so that you don't actually end up running it multiple times over.